name is Jamie Kwong. I am a research assistant with the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Program here at RUSI. So this next hour, what we're going to be looking at are global nuclear programs. So who has nuclear weapons and what are their general postures and plans for the future? Before I begin though, a little caveat. I did my darndest to remove all of my American spellings, but I apologize if there's Z's and all that good stuff. Okay, so I wanted to start with a question. How many nuclear capable states are there? I'll say according to the nuclear notebook, or the general conceptions of which states have nuclear weapons. 7, 8. Any other guesses? 20. Okay. So according to Plowshares, Nuclear Notebooks, a couple other sources, there are 9 nuclear capable states. So this is a very useful map, again, put on by the Plowshares.org. And so I say nuclear capable instead of nuclear weapon states, because we'll get into the particularities of that later when we talk about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there are only 5 states that are officially recognized as nuclear weapon states. So that's the US, UK, China, France, and Russia. In addition to that, we have 4 other nuclear capable states, being Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. And so you can see kind of their weapon counts here, listed in order of who has the most and who has the least. You can see that Russia and the US make up about 92% of this global stockpile, so they definitely have the majority of the weapons. And these counts include both those weapons that are deployed and stored in their arsenals. So just a point, again, this is going to be recorded, so you'll have these as well. But a lot of what I'm pulling from are the Nuclear Notebook, which I mentioned already, which is an annual report that's issued by the Federation of American Scientists, and they do the authoritative reporting on different country profiles in regards to nuclear weapons issues, as well as the Arms Control Organization fact sheets. All right, so what I'll do now is I'll walk you through each of our nuclear capable states, and at the end also touch on Iran a little bit. But I want to do is kind of give you quick facts about each of the states and then go into their nuclear postures and policies, as well as what's on the horizons. So to begin with Russia. Russia first conducted a nuclear test in 1949. Is thought to currently possess 6,850 nuclear weapons. And in terms of how it can deliver those nuclear weapons, it has platforms that can be delivered via land, sea, or air. So going into its military doctrine, which was most recently updated and publicly released in December 2014, the Russian Federation, quote, reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction against it and/or its allies, as well as in response to aggression against the Russian Federation that utilizes conventional weapons that threatens the very existence of the state. So there's really that emphasis on WMD attacks and existential threats posed to Russia and its allies. How many people have heard the phrase tossed around, escalate to de-escalate? Some nods in the room, yeah. So this has been kind of, I put a question mark there because it's been kind of a contested concept, but essentially escalate to de-escalate means that Russia potentially might be willing to use a limited first use of nuclear weapons in order to de-escalate the conflict. So that use would be the escalation, but with the ultimate purpose of de-escalating what would be a conventional conflict there. And so, for instance, the U.S. 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which is a policy document I'll talk about when I talk about the U.S., assigns this posture to Russia. Question mark is put there, though, because it's a contested concept. A lot of people have pointed out that that military doctrine I just read to you already kind of encapsulates Russia's reserved right to potentially use nuclear weapons in the threat of an existential crisis. So some say that this escalate to de-escalate concept is overblown. But the counter to that would be that there seems to be more statements and activities in the last decade that kind of expand the potential threat of Russian nuclear forces being used outside of any existential area. So that's likely going to be a continued conversation we're going to see in the policy realm and thinking about Russian nuclear strategy in the future. And so this next point, non-strategic nuclear weapons, as Tom already mentioned, is a problematic phrase as he was discussing. But essentially here, what it's trying to capture are shorter range weapons intended in particular to offset NATO and US conventional capabilities and increasingly Chinese capabilities as well. And so the idea is that these can provide Russia with more flexible and kind of regional warfighting capabilities. So there's concerns here, though, that as these new systems are being developed, they're increasingly dual capable. Again, something Tom mentioned, but that means that they can take on either conventional or nuclear missions. And so it becomes more and more uncertain as to which mission that particular weapon is taking on. So this is a particular area of concern that the Trump administration has cited and even responded to in the call for development of more comparable forces. So looking at what's in the future of Russian military strategy, nuclear strategies and posture. So we have modernization with an S, not a Z. So there's a continued modernization campaign to replace Soviet-era systems. And in particular, in March 2018, President Putin has highlighted several new weapon systems that are in development, really emphasizing that nuclear forces are seen as critical to Russian security and as its status as a great power. But there's a lot of uncertainty about what's next, and that uncertainty is affecting how the West is responding. So it's affecting Western postures and military spending. So there's still a lot of question marks here that's going to take some time to figure out. So that's on the horizon as well. And then there's also an emphasis on a real concern over US ballistic missile defense capabilities. So there's been strong statements against this. BMD is the abbreviation there. And that includes an explicit threat to use nuclear weapons against BMD facilities. So that kind of as well feeds the escalate to de-escalate debate that I mentioned before. And then, of course, everybody's favorite in the news lately has been talk of the INF Treaty. That's the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed in 1987 between Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev. And it banned ground launch, specifically ground launch, ballistic and cruise missiles with a range of 500 to 5,000 kilometers. And so since 2014, the US has claimed that Russia has been violating the INF with the development of a new weapon system that falls within that ground-launched range. And the Russian response had included accusations that the US was also violating the treaty. And then we saw in October 2018, President Trump announced the US intention to withdraw from the treaty. So we saw a lot of dialogue there, and there were attempts at bringing Russia back into compliance, including greater information sharing between the US and its NATO partners to try to really put that pressure on Russia. But ultimately, there was no agreement reached, and both US and Russia announced official withdrawal earlier this month. But there is a 6-month withdrawal period, which some people are hoping can be used to still salvage the deal. But if nothing changes, that means that the treaty will be officially dissolved on the 2nd of August this year. All right, so moving on to the US. The US was first tested its nuclear weapons in 1945, and as I'm sure you all know, is the only state ever to have used nuclear weapons on Japan in 1945. So it has an arsenal of 6,550 weapons and has a nuclear triad, again, being able to launch from land, sea, or air. So looking at the US nuclear posture, what we rely on is the Nuclear Posture Review, which is a document that's customary for presidential administrations to release in public form that kind of envisions and lays out the administration's nuclear policy. And so the Trump administration released theirs in 2018. You'll see a lot of the 2018 NPR is what that means. So there's an emphasis in that NPR on the fundamental role of US nuclear policy being deterrence. And so the Nuclear Notebook, again, the resource I cited before, claims that the Trump review takes a more confrontational tone and prevents an assertive posture that seeks to increase reliance on nuclear weapons. So you see that through the development of new weapon systems and the modernization of others. In terms of declaratory policy, the US says that it will only use nuclear weapons under extreme circumstances, which also includes significant non-nuclear strategic attacks to defend its vital interests. Again, an emphasis on that existential threat, but does include non-nuclear attacks there. And it also offers a negative security assurance. So what that means is that the US will not use nuclear weapons against those states that are non-nuclear weapon states according to the NPT and are adhering to their obligations under the NPT. So again, specifically has to do with the NPT, non-nuclear weapon states there. Another emphasis that we see in the 2018 NPR was this focus on flexibility. So it says, the United States will enhance the flexibility and range of its tailored deterrence options, expanding flexible US nuclear options now to include low-yield options, which I'll touch on in a moment, is important for the preservation of credible deterrence against regional aggression. The US also offers extended deterrence, as Tom was talking about in his previous presentation. It provides a nuclear umbrella to its NATO allies as well as to some of its East Asian allies. And a key part of especially the Trump administration's nuclear posture is ballistic missile defense, so BMD here again. The Trump administration released its ballistic missile review last month after a number of delays. And we see greater emphasis put on great power competition. So there was specific mention of Russia and China, whereas, for instance, the Obama administration had avoided kind of directly saying that. And essentially what BMD is attempts to defend against missile attacks. And so these systems have really been met with limited success, but a lot of people still cite the problematic and potentially destabilizing nature of ballistic missile defense systems, as can be seen through Russia's response, as well as China's response, which I'll get to in a moment. In terms of modernization, there's a modernization campaign initiated by the Obama administration as the program of record, essentially to replace every weapon in the nuclear arsenal as they've kind of outlived their lifespan. So spending-wise, that's going to turn into about $1.5 trillion over the next 30 years to both maintain and modernize that arsenal. And then talking about low-yield nuclear weapons, which I mentioned just a moment ago. So the US National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, another one of those abbreviations for you, just announced the first of new warheads are off the production line and would be in initial operational capability by the end of September. So again, this was a call in the 2018 NPR, largely as a response directly to Russian non-strategic capabilities. So again, it's intended to provide a more flexible deterrent, and really, as the NPR says, low-yield nuclear weapons will help ensure that potential adversaries perceive no possible advantage in limited nuclear escalation, making nuclear employment less likely. But again, there's the idea that this could be misperceived by potential adversaries as instead a greater willingness to use nuclear weapons in a limited way and early on, and that could potentially initiate a new arms race. So you'll see kind of the general theme that perceptions and misperceptions are very important in nuclear policy world. And as well, the INF Treaty dissolution is relevant to the US. Okay, so moving on to France. France first conducted its nuclear weapons test in 1960, currently possesses an arsenal of about 300 weapons, and has delivery platforms via sea or air. So France has a posture of strict sufficiency. So that's basically saying that France keeps its weapons arsenal at the lowest possible level according to the strategic context or the geopolitical environment and threats that it faces. It claims that it's strictly a defensive arsenal to only be used in extreme circumstances of legitimate self-defense. It also offers a negative security assurance unless it's facing an invasion or sustained attack against its territories, armed forces, or states with which it has security agreements, and the attack is in an alliance with a nuclear weapons state. So a couple little caveats there. In terms of NATO policy, so of the 3 nuclear weapons states that are part of NATO, US, UK, France, France does not include its nuclear forces within the alliance's integrated military command structure. So essentially that means that France doesn't participate in the nuclear policy-making bodies and doesn't put its weapons in that structure. So it does this because, as stated in the Defense Ministry's 2013 white paper, the French nuclear deterrent ensures permanently our independence of decision-making and our freedom of action within the framework of our international responsibilities, including in the event of any threat of blackmail that might be directed against us in the event of a crisis. So there's really that emphasis on independence of decision-making. France doesn't necessarily want to be wrapped up in any delays of decision-making that might come by working in the integrated alliance structure there. Delivery platforms, as I mentioned, France can only deliver via sea and air, and that's because in 1996, France made the decision to eliminate its land-based ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missile programs, and instead focuses more on its SSBNs, the nuclear-powered ballistic missile carrying submarines, as the main figure in its deterrence strategy. And so it operates continuous at-sea deterrence, which means that there's always at least one nuclear-capable sub patrolling the seas at any given time. And here, looking at modernization, we see, again, an emphasis on those SSBNs. So the Triomphe class are expected to reach the end of their operational lives in the 2030s. So France will be developing a new generation of those subs. And they're likely to spend 25 billion euro between 2019 and 2023, which will include those initial modernization efforts. All right, moving on to China. So China first tested its nuclear weapons in 1964 and currently has an arsenal of 280, and again can deliver via the triad land, sea, or air. So China is the only recognized nuclear weapon state by the NPT to have a no first use policy. So essentially what that means is that China has said that it will never be the first to use a nuclear weapon and instead maintains an arsenal strictly for the second strike capability, that is retaliation in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. And so you might see this in the news as some people are questioning whether China will stay committed to its no first use policy, but it does officially have a no first use policy. It also claims to have a minimum but credible deterrent, which means that it maintains the minimum level of nuclear weapons required to maintain national security and deter a first strike. So it's really intent on maintaining that second strike capability, again, going back to that no first use bit. So those are the hardened forces that would survive a nuclear attack to ensure retaliation capabilities should deterrence fail. China also keeps its nuclear weapons on low alert levels. The warheads are thought to be stored in central control during peacetime. The warheads themselves are demated from the actual delivery vehicle system, so it also takes a lot longer for China to need to launch or to be able to launch a strike, as the two would have to be mated before they could do so. China also does not offer any nuclear umbrellas to its allies or partners, unlike the US. And we also see another negative security assurance here, again, that China won't use its nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state that is adhering to its obligations under the NPT or in nuclear weapons-free zones, another thing that Christina will cover later today. In terms of modernization, the Nuclear Notebook says that China's modernized force is more mobile, responsive, and accurate, and can overwhelm a limited US ballistic missile defense system. So looking first at that bit on mobility, we see additional SSBNs under development. So the first fleet was launched in March 2014. We had 4 Jin-class SSBNs. And there's more likely to come as they've already been commissioned, and there's likely a next generation coming in the decade. And there was a speculated deterrence patrol in 2015. It's unclear if that sub had a nuclear weapon on it, but there could be preparing for future deterrence patrols. And that would be a significant change in its demating policy, because if you have a nuclear weapons sub on patrol, that means that the warhead is likely attached to the delivery system. So again, as a lot of these modernization bits that I'm talking about occur, it could be affecting the policy and posture of the state. In response to the US ballistic missile defense system, again, we're seeing development of more MIRVs, as Tom had mentioned, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. So we see as China is modernizing its system and developing new systems as well, it's speculated that they're creating more MIRV-capable weapons. But mostly, the idea is that they would be used for decoys or penetration as you're having the multiple vehicles coming off, rather than to increase the counterforce capability. So it really is, again, in response to the US BMD. So this is where a lot of people are getting kind of the evidence that US BMD capabilities are destabilizing, because it is affecting other states' postures. Okay, looking at the UK. UK first tested its nuclear weapons in 1952 and currently has an arsenal of 215 with stated intentions to lower that. And it only has a delivery platform via the sea. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, as we do have colleagues from the MOD coming in to do a whole presentation on UK nuclear policy, but just some of the highlights. The main point of the policy and posture is an independent, minimum, credible deterrent. So while the UK does procure Trident missiles from the US, it maintains full operational independence. And the purpose of the arsenal is to deter the most extreme threats to UK national security and, quote, the way of life now and in the future. And so it does have a unilateral commitment to reduce its arsenal to 180 weapons by the mid-2020s as well. So we do see the UK as one of the 5 nuclear weapon states as the state that has done the most to decrease its arsenal size. It also has a policy of continuous at-sea deterrence, or CASD, you might have heard. So again, the sea is its only delivery platform. There's always a nuclear submarine on patrol at any given time. And this is actually a policy that's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, so you might hear CASD 50 pop up along there. And then on the horizon, we have Dreadnought. Has anybody heard of Dreadnought yet? Yeah? Okay. Some of you might work on Dreadnought stuff, but essentially our Vanguard-class submarines are reaching the end of their lifespan, and so Dreadnought has been the system that's been voted in and funded to replace them. So it will be 31 billion pounds over 25 years, with a 10 billion pound contingency to build these 4 new submarines. And I also wanted to touch a little bit on potential future challenges that the UK posture might face. So first is thinking about Scotland. I know this came up, I believe, in 2014, long before I was out here. But the UK nuclear subs are based in Scotland. So there's this question and concern that should Scotland vote to leave the UK at any point in the future, the UK would then have to think about where to put their subs. That would prove very challenging in both physical terms and costs as well. So that's something that could potentially be on the horizon. There's also the speculation over a change in government, in particular thinking about Jeremy Corbyn and the speculation over his commitment to the nuclear deterrent. It could potentially mean that a change in government could result in a change in the UK's nuclear posture. But again, something to think about as the future unfolds. Okay, moving on to Pakistan. So this is, again, not a recognized nuclear weapon state, but it is a nuclear capable state. Pakistan is not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It first tested its nuclear weapons in 1998 and currently has an arsenal of 150 and can deliver via land and air with a question mark put on sea, which I'll get to in a moment. So Pakistan has a full spectrum deterrent. That is, it has a force capable of responding to nuclear attacks and countering, in particular, an Indian conventional incursion onto Pakistani territory. So you'll see a lot with Pakistan that there's this heavy emphasis put on Indian capabilities and perceptions of Indian intentions. essentially, the Pakistani nuclear forces were created in response to the development of Indian nuclear forces. So there really is that tension in South Asia that sometimes goes kind of overlooked by a lot in the policy community, but it's definitely an area of contention to pay close attention to. And so this full spectrum deterrent, Pakistan claims, falls in line with, again, another policy of credible minimum deterrence and a policy of no first use against non-nuclear weapon states. But there has been concern raised over the potential lowering threshold for the nuclear use. This expansion that I'll get to in a moment, the Director of National Intelligence from the US has cited that these new types of nuclear weapons will introduce new risks for escalation dynamics and security in the region. Pakistan does have a disassembled storage system as well, so again, the warheads are not stored on the delivery systems. But there is speculation here as to whether that's true for their shorter range systems, because they do want to have kind of the speed to be able to deploy those much quicker. In terms of expansion, we do see moves by Pakistan to expand its nuclear arsenal. So the Nuclear Notebook estimates that it could have 220 to 250 warheads by 2025. Again, currently it's estimated to have 150, so that could be an increase by 100 by 2025. But that really depends on two things. Number one, how many nuclear-capable launchers Pakistan plans to employ, and number two, how much the Indian nuclear arsenal grows. Again, really the emphasis on Pakistan responding to Indian developments. And so the expansion here, though, does include the development of a sea-based delivery system, so that's why I put the question mark on the previous slide. If it doesn't yet have a sea-based delivery system, it's developing and testing those systems now, so it's likely to in the future. We also see an emphasis on short-range nuclear-capable systems that would be able to counter military threats below the strategic level. Again, some of the problematic language Tom pointed out before. But those in particular are a big security concern. There's a lot of concern by the international community that those could be exploited by terrorist attacks. And so that's some of the stuff that Alberto will be covering in our final session of the day when he looks at nuclear safety and security. All right, moving right along. So in terms of India, India first tested its nuclear weapons in 1974. Currently has an arsenal of 130 and can deliver through all three. And so it really emphasizes its nuclear triad as necessary for second strike, and so really has that second strike emphasis. So the punitive retaliation is where that comes in. So it says that the size of its arsenal is based on maintaining that minimal credible deterrent, but that it really needs to have those second strike capabilities should deterrence fail. India also has a no first use policy, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So in January 2003, it reiterated this, saying that it won't use nuclear weapons against states that don't possess nuclear weapons, and that it would only use nuclear weapons against a nuclear attack. However, this has been weakened by a number of statements. So for instance, in 2006, amidst a dispute with Pakistan, the then defense minister indicated that India wouldn't bind itself to that no first use policy, which threw up a lot of question marks in the international community. And there's also been the declaration that India reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to biological or chemical weapons attacks. So still within that WMD framework, but expanding it from that nuclear specific. So that's kind of been undermining some people's faith in India's no first use policy. India also has a disassembled storage pattern. So again, warheads not stored on the delivery vehicles. And interesting, India's arsenal are all plutonium-based weapons, whereas in a lot of the other states, you'll either see a mix of highly enriched uranium weapons and plutonium weapons, or largely just HEU. But India just has the plutonium-based weapons there. So in terms of modernization, we see India developing new weapons systems, and there's at least 5 currently in development, according to the Nuclear Notebook, with a particular focus on land and sea delivery. And so this would the advancement of these weapons would require additional warheads, and it's thought that India currently has enough plutonium to make more, to have a total of 150 to 200 weapons from its current 130, and that it potentially has more plans to build a plutonium production reactor in order to make more plutonium at that weapons grade level. There's also this Sino shift, or a turn to the threat from China. So Vipin Narang is one of the leading scholars on South Asian nuclear affairs, and so he said, "We may be witnessing what I call a decoupling of Indian nuclear strategy between China and Pakistan. The force requirements India needs in order to credibly threaten assured retaliation against China may allow it to pursue more aggressive strategies, such as escalation dominance or a splendid first strike against Pakistan." And so while we see Pakistan's posture really focusing on Indian moves and really responding to what India is doing, India is starting to not just respond to Pakistan, but also think about the threat coming from China. We also see India increasing its SSBN activity. So it's speculated to have first introduced the SSBN in late 2016 and a second in November 2017. But just this past November, Prime Minister Modi announced that India's SSBN had completed its first deterrence patrol. And so there's the future prospects that it would continue to do so. A lot are thinking that it wouldn't be a continuous deterrence patrol, but rather more occasional. But there are question marks being thrown up about command and control challenges that come with having a nuclear submarine, as well as it could shift, again, that demating policy, that disassembled storage policy. And so, as I kind of alluded to in terms of the no first use, people are questioning whether the Indian no first use is really credible, and so there's this potential shift to a preemptive nuclear doctrine, that is, that it would be willing to use nuclear weapons first in particular circumstances. Okay. Moving on to Israel, there's a lot of question marks here. So Israel has not conducted an official test. Some do speculate that it may have jointly conducted a nuclear test with South Africa in 1979, but that's contested. But it is believed that Israel has nuclear weapons and has 80 in its current arsenal and can deliver via land, sea, or air. So this is pretty blank because, again, we don't know much about Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. Israel has claimed that it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East, and it maintains highly ambiguous postures and doctrines surrounding its nuclear arsenal, and it's very secretive about its capabilities, but it is suspected, again, to have 80 nuclear weapons and a nuclear triad. Don't really know what's on the horizon in the future as well. Where we do see Israel come into play a lot in the nuclear realm is their disagreement with the JCPOA, which I'll mention in a bit, but the Iran nuclear deal, Israel was very against that deal. Okay, turning to North Korea, hot topic. Christina's our expert, our resident DPRK expert in the back. But North Korea first tested its nuclear weapons in 2006 and is currently believed to have 20 weapons. It's speculated that they likely have the fissile material to build 30 to 60 weapons, but again, currently has about 20 assembled. And as of now, its delivery platforms are via land and sea. And so I just want to mention a little bit about I'm going to screw this up. The Bunjin policy. Sorry, I don't speak Korean. But this was something that Kim Jong-un has declared was the state's parallel development of both the economy and its nuclear weapons program. And as of 2018, in Kim Jong-un's New Year's Day speech, which is really where we get the direct source, the most understanding of DPRK policy, he declared that the goals of nuclear development were met and that the state would concentrate its efforts on socialist economic construction. So we've kind of seen that shift in parallel with a lot of the diplomatic activity that's been occurring between the US and DPRK on the nuclear front. And so again, North Korea also has a no first use policy here, but I put a little asterisk because it says that it won't use nuclear weapons first unless its sovereignty is under threat. So there is that caveat there. In terms of non-proliferation and denuclearization, the DPRK has stated that it will, quote, faithfully fulfill its obligation for non-proliferation and strive for global denuclearization. But really here there's this contested notion of what denuclearization actually means, and people have different definitions and assume that the North Koreans have different definitions than the Americans, for instance, as evidenced by actions taken since the first Trump-Kim summit, which happened in June 2018. On the horizon, we have the Trump-Kim Summit 2.0, which is actually happening at the end of this month on the 27th and 28th of February in Vietnam. And so again, this comes after a year of 2018 filled with diplomatic overtures between the US and the DPRK. Sorry, DPRK is the official name of North Korea, so I keep throwing that out there. But during that first summit, we saw in Singapore, there was a joint statement that came out between the US and DPRK, with each agreeing to establish new relations between the two countries and build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. And so Kim has stated that he's committed to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in return for security agreements and especially sanctions relief from Trump and Western allies. But again, there's this disagreement on what denuclearization means. A lot of people speculate that the US government interprets this as the dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear program, whereas North Korea really focuses on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which might include the removal of any US nuclear umbrellas or forces protecting South Korea as well. And so in Kim's most recent New Year's Day speech, 2019, he claimed that the DPRK is a responsible nuclear weapons state, citing in particular the cessation of the testing that's occurred since the 2018 overtures, and calls on the US to start fulfilling its side of the bargain. So he said, if the United States does not keep the promise it made in the eyes of the world, and out of miscalculation of our people's patience, it attempts to unilaterally enforce something upon us, and persists in imposing sanctions and pressures against our republic, we may be compelled to find a new way for defending the sovereignty of the country and the supreme interests of the state, and for achieving peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula. So there's a lot of question marks coming up before this second summit, so that's definitely something to keep track of as that nears. There's been stuff in the news today that I was catching on Twitter this morning as to what both sides are expecting and what both sides can come to an agreement on before the leaders of each state meet. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. All right, I'm moving quick. Okay, and finally Iran. So Iran does not have nuclear weapons. So what I put here is its quick facts, is that its breakout time, that is how long it might take to create a nuclear weapon, is estimated to be about a year. And so that's an important time frame because of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the JCPOA, or more colloquially as the Iran nuclear deal. So you probably saw this in the news, you're probably aware of it, especially a couple years ago. So essentially the background here is for the past 2 decades, there's been international concern over Iranian efforts to develop a nuclear weapons system. And so everything from uranium enrichment to warhead design to delivery system design, and some speculate development, really had the international community concerned that Iran would develop nuclear capabilities, and if not, would have a very short breakout time. That is, that it had everything and just would have to put it all together in a matter of weeks, months, whatever it might be. And so the international community started conducting negotiations with Iran, some done in secret and then some done more transparently, really to pressure Iran to cease these activities and any related to the advancement of its nuclear weapons program. And so the result was the JCPOA, which big timeline points was adopted in October 2015 and terminates a decade later on October 2025. And so essentially what the JCPOA does is it restricts Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief from the US and Europe. And so that includes enrichment activities, disabling cores at reactors, and the like. And importantly also puts a good number of monitoring and verification measures in there by international bodies like the IAEA. And there's specific metrics set out at different timelines throughout the deal. That's why the 2015 to 2025 is really important as to what Iran should accomplish by each date. And so really focusing on the policy side of things, we saw this as an agreement between the P5+1. So the P5 being the permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, also the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states by the NPT, and that 1 is Germany. And so they negotiated this deal with Iran for a number of years, came to that agreement in 2015, and then in May 2018, we saw the Trump administration withdraw from the JCPOA. And this is despite verification that Iran is currently in compliance with its JCPOA obligations. And so this kind of harkens back to the controversy surrounding the deal domestically in the US back in 2015. There was many concerns over what people call the sunset clause, being that the deal terminates in 2025. But ultimately, US withdrawal does not mean dissolution of the agreement. However, it does put a lot of pressure on the agreement itself, because as the US has withdrawn, it's reinstated its sanctions on the Iranian regime in the snapback. And that could deter businesses from investing in Iran, which is the whole point of the deal. So we see the European partners, which are still very committed to this deal, actively working to prevent businesses being detracted from investing because of the US withdrawal from the agreement. Okay, that's all I've got for you. Do we have any questions?